All right, the next set of arguments is about culture. It's this argument that, you know, Americans are different, we believe different things. We read the Steinmo piece this week, which argued that no, that's not really the case. Swedes and Americans actually have fairly similar interests and desires, but what's different is the way the political system is set up. We'll take on those arguments in a minute. The argument here is that Americans are very much about liberty. They don't want the government telling them what to do. They're very much about individualism. There's an egalitarian strain in the United States. There's also racist strains and patriarchal strains as well, right? There's a big focus on work. And you'll notice that a lot of American welfare programs are all about work. They're work conditioned. They're about how much you earn in work, et cetera, et cetera. You know, under Clinton, Bill Clinton, there was a reform of the welfare program to try and encourage and mandate more work on the part of poor recipients of that program. And there's also sort of this notion of laissez-faire or market fundamentalism. Laissez-faire is French for let it be. Okay, and it's a notion, not the Beatles album, but just, you know, the idea that you should let the economy alone and it will work properly if the government stays out of the way. Okay, there's a few critiques of this. So one is it's sort of an argument that the United States has had these values from the beginning, and if that's true, why has the United States sometimes had big gains in social policy, like during the New Deal, for example? Did the United States suddenly change its values during that time? Okay, so a sort of argument that applies to all of American history is not going to be able to really handle any variation in that history. Okay, a second critique is that it is sometimes hard to speak of an American set of values, right? There's lots of values in the United States. I don't share many of these values on here, laissez-faire, for example. I don't share those values, okay? Bernie Sanders doesn't share those values. Hillary either doesn't share those values, okay? So this sort of a notion is like, well, is there really an American creed or not? A third point, which I think is quite persuasive, is that these are pretty vague concepts, right? And so it's very possible to take a particular policy and cover it with these concepts, okay? To wrap it in the flag, in other words, okay? And a good example of this, for example, like in Obamacare, proponents of the public option, okay? This was going to be a government-run insurance program, the public option, but the way that they sold it is that it would allow consumers in the marketplaces to have more choices, okay? That is very much a sort of free market-ish type of argument. Okay, you're saying, oh, we're not trying to replace the private market, we're just trying to provide more choices, okay? And that's what markets are supposed to do, provide us with all these choices and then we decide what to do, okay? Pro-choice, okay? Very much an argument about like, who's gonna tell you what to do with your body, okay? You or the government, okay? So this is, again, this attempt to sort of make pro-choice arguments sort of fit with these American ideologies, okay? And so I guess my point here is that I don't think culture is quite as constraining as some people who make this argument do. I think it is quite possible to, you know, make your program, the thing you want to pass, make it seem as American as apple pie. And I think it's possible to do, okay? All right. And then the last point is this point that we read in the Steinmo piece. He's arguing that no, you know, public opinion is not that different in the US and Sweden. Comments or questions here? Okay. Okay, the last, my favorite set of arguments, the political institutional arguments. Okay? So political institutions are really, you know, just a good definition of them is the rules of the game. Okay, just like if you were playing basketball or soccer, you know, you can do certain things, you can't do certain things, and those rules have impacts. When the NBA established a three-point line, it changed everything. Okay? All of a sudden there was more room on the court. It allowed Steph Curry to become what he is, et cetera, right? Rules have consequences, okay? And they do in politics as well, okay? And so you're going to find these rules in a variety of places. Especially you'll find them in the Constitution, the way the Constitution sets up the separation of powers, et cetera. You'll find them in the rules of the parties, like we're going through a primary process right now, where you'll notice that in some states, the winner gets all the delegates, and in other states they share the delegates, right? And so that has implications, right? So all these things really matter for what happens in politics, okay? Oh, let me just add that many of us also consider existing policies to be a political institution. So in the healthcare case, the fact that we already had private health insurance, as you saw, was an important impediment to passing national health insurance. Okay. Many of the other countries that established national health insurance, Britain as an example, they established it in 1948, and there really wasn't much of a private insurance market at that time. Okay, so they didn't face the same kinds of opposition that Obama ended up having to face. Okay, although the doctors were quite opposed, and the way that they got, I love this phrase, the way that they got the doctors to come on board. The architect of the plan, he said, "I stuffed their mouths with gold." All right, so the first set of arguments is really the Steinmo article, which you read. Okay, so we're going to go through 4 sets of arguments. Oh no, only 3. Okay, good. So one has to do with political fragmentation and its impacts. The second has to do with the way that federalism produced a weak labor movement. And the third has to do with the ways in which the United States was not really a democracy until 1970. Okay? And I've already talked to you in previous classes about the under-democratization of the South. I'm going to review that. But I also want to talk a little bit about the under-democratization of northeastern cities, the big cities, Boston, New York, Chicago, for much of the 20th century. Okay? All right, so let's do that. On political fragmentation, the argument here is that the United States that power is unusually divided, and that in order to get something passed, as we saw, you need to get both houses of Congress to approve it. You need to get the president to approve it. Moreover, within each of those houses, there are a variety of committees which must also approve it. And then after you get all that done, somebody will inevitably sue, and it will go to the Supreme Court, as Obamacare has now several times, okay? And so, and then we also have the issue of, the states were initially mandated to expand Medicaid to more people, but then the Supreme Court ruled that they didn't have to, and now, as you know, many of the Republican states have not done so, okay? And they're all against the Medicaid expansion with the exception of Kasich, who did expand Medicaid in Ohio when he was governor. So there's another way in which Obamacare was quite politically fragmented. When you were in high school, you probably learned about this idea under the rubric of divided powers. Okay? And in high school, you were told that it was a great thing. Okay? It was a really great thing about American politics. Okay? Because what it means is that nobody can get too much power. Okay? Moreover, when George Bush was in office, and maybe if you didn't like George Bush, you were thrilled that the Democrats had one of the houses, right? You didn't want him to have full power, okay? And so, yeah, I understand the argument about sort of the benefits of this division of powers. However, and you might think of the division of powers sort of benefiting or hurting both parties. Okay? But I do think there's a bias to it. And the reason for that is that there's one party that wants to do things with government, the Democrats, and there's another party which would like to keep government as small as possible and do as little as possible. Okay? And so if political fragmentation is preventing shit from happening, okay, one of the parties likes that situation better than the other party. Okay? So I think there is a sort of political bias to political fragmentation. Okay? It advantages the Republicans and disadvantages the Democrats. Now there are some exceptions. There are things Republicans want to do, like restrict abortion and other things. And political fragmentation protects abortion in many ways, abortion rights. The Supreme Court has protected abortion, right? In many states, there'll be a divided legislature, and the Republicans are unable to do what they want to accomplish on abortion, okay? So it's not like it's always good for the Republicans and always bad for the Democrats, but in general, I think there is a bias against action, and since the Democrats want to do things with government, the bias applies to them. The other thing that's bad about this, and you saw it in the movie, is that because there are so many little spots that the legislation has to get through, there's lots of places where opponents can jam up things, okay? And they know it, and they spend money to do it. And the best example of this from the movie is Baucus, okay? Baucus was running the Senate Finance Committee. All the shit had to get through Baucus, and he was just raking in the dough from the healthcare industry. Okay, so there's really, you can identify these little points where you're going to be able to block things. Okay, so opponents of various legislation have lots of opportunities to block things. Okay, they're called veto points. Okay, and then the last part about this is because of all these veto points, there are a lot of side payments that need to be made. You need to stuff people's mouths full of gold. You need to pay them off. You need to make sure that you're going to do, just as an example, the insurance companies wanted the individual mandate. They were not going to support Obamacare unless they got the individual mandate, and they got it, right? And so I actually think it's fairly good policy, but the point here is that policies end up with lots of, sometimes they'll call them Christmas tree bills. Okay, so you have a Christmas tree, and each person who can block the bill gets to put their own ornament on the bill. And when you get done, it looks like shit, okay? Because, it's just all over the place, right? And so this is the notion, is that political fragmentation also produces crappy policy, like the Affordable Care Act. I'm a huge fan of the Affordable Care Act. I'm glad it passed, but it's also just a big mess. And for a reason. Because it had to get through our political system, okay? The last point here is that political fragmentation used to be manageable when the two parties were closer together because the moderates in each party could cut deals with each other and get bills passed, okay? Now that the parties are so distant and so uncooperative with each other, political polarization plus fragmentation equals gridlock. Okay? We're stuck. Okay? And I don't see a way out of it. There are some proposals. There are some proposals for getting us out of it, but the people who are currently benefiting from the system would have to, approve those proposals. Federalism. So part of the reason that the United States never developed a very strong labor movement is that labor law, by the Constitution, labor law was designated to the states, okay? And so states made the labor laws, and whenever they tried to do something that labor liked, business would say, oh, we're going to leave California, we're going to go to Nevada, okay? And so that was really quite a break on their ability to get policies passed. In addition, a lot of state courts would rule against labor movements when they tried to establish things like a minimum wage or a restriction on working hours or restrictions on child labor, et cetera, et cetera. The courts would end up overruling those things. And so eventually the unions were, they're like, fuck it, okay? We're losing every time. I think we're gonna do something else, and they moved to something called business unionism, okay? In business unionism, instead of trying to achieve stuff politically, you try and get it from your employer. Okay, through strikes, through negotiations, et cetera. And that's partially why we have so much private provision in the United States, because unions and a large part of that sort of employer-provided health benefits, employer-provided pension benefits, et cetera, are from places that were unionized, that are unionized or were unionized at one time. Okay, unions fought for those benefits from their employer, but it's only for them, right? Nobody else gets it, right? It's not a political thing would unite the whole working class. Collective bargaining, you're just getting it for you, okay, you and your buddies, okay? So it's a very different kind of unionism. And there have been battles within the labor movement over what kind of unionism should be embraced. Although, unions are over. It's over. It's over. They're dead. It's over. No. Why? No. Are you taping me? I'm going to edit that out. I'm going to totally edit that out. Okay. All right. No, unions, we still got a chance. On the last day of class, I'm going to ask you, did this class make you more optimistic or more pessimistic? And it's exactly the kind of statement that I just made that I should not be making. Okay? So I'll stop. All right. So then we're going to talk about the South. You've seen this before. The point here is that after Reconstruction, the white Southerners imposed a new slavery regime, sharecropping. Plantation owners dominated the economy. They used black workers at very low wages. Often many black workers were in the sharecropping system. They would get into deep levels of debt with the plantation owner and thus were unable to leave, essentially. So really slavery by another name. In the South, one-party regime. Republicans aren't competitive. It's just the Democrats for the most part. Segregation. And a political party that really has no interest in helping the have-nots, the less well-off, both poor whites and poor blacks, okay? Very much excluded from politics, okay? And then the last point to make here is that not only did this have implications within the South, okay? Unions couldn't form, social movements couldn't form, etc., but it also had implications on the national level because the Southern legislators gained disproportionate power at the federal level because that being a committee chair was based on your seniority. And since Southerners never lost, because oftentimes they would run unopposed, okay? So they would basically be in Congress for life and they would develop high levels of seniority and you'd have committee after committee run by Southerners, okay? When FDR took office, he had some plans, but he had to, for example, exclude African Americans from Social Security in order to get the Southerners to sign off on it, okay? These are the sorts of constraints that the South put on, the federal welfare regime. Questions about that? He was not a racist, but that was racist. That was a racist thing, right? Obviously. So I should also add that, there were many bills to deal with lynching during FDR's time, and he gave no support to them whatsoever. None. Eleanor was an outspoken opponent of lynching, but FDR didn't do anything. All right. And then the last thing I want to talk about is under-democratization in northern cities. And if you've ever seen Gangs of New York, this is what Gangs of New York is about. So these are a particular kind of political party called a patronage party, and they don't care about policy. They have no desire to get anything done. They have no ideology. All they want to do is make money and have power, okay? And so the way that they get in office is they give the people who vote for them money or goods and things like that. And they also, if a business will give them money, they'll do special things for the business. They'll give the business some special contracts. Maybe the businessman is a drug dealer. They'll let the drug dealer do his business and the police won't enforce the law in that drug dealer's territory. Okay? So this is politics as a business, politics as a way to make money and gain power. If you've seen The Wire, that's also another example of this sort of politics, right? It's all just about, power and money, okay? So these patronage regimes were in existence in most of the major cities of the Northeast, really from the end of the Civil War until about 1970. Sometimes you'll hear these referred to also as political machines. So the most famous ones are like the machine of Boss Tweed, the machine of Mayor Daley in Chicago, things like that. What else should I say? Oh, often those patronage parties were ethnically based. So they'd be, so you'd have the Irish would run a city, like Boston, for example, or the Italians would run a city or certain parts of it, things like that. And also a lot of connection to organized crime as well. So whenever you watch an organized crime movie, there's always cops being paid off, and there's often elected officials being paid off. Okay, so these big city sort of deals. Oh, I should add, so John Sayles, who I just mentioned about Matewan, he also has quite a good movie on these sorts of regimes as well. I didn't really realize that he did both of those. I mean, that's interesting. Okay. The other thing is that these regimes are worried that somebody might displace them. Okay, so whenever any sort of opponent or social movement appears, they go and beat the shit out of them. Okay, with the cops. They send the cops over and beat them up. Okay, and so they use the police to repress their opponents. Okay. Lastly, and this is kind of interesting, is that they're generally opposed to the welfare state, because the welfare state goes to everyone, or many programs do, but they love a program where they get the money first, and then they get to distribute it. Okay, so if you give aid to the cities, they love that. Okay, because then they can make sure that all that money goes to their political supporters and their business supporters. Okay, I should also add that prior to the progressive era, there was no secret ballot in the United States. So actually, it was publicly visible who you were voting for. You would each party would have a colored card, and so you would go and pick up the colored card and then go put it in the box. And so the patronage parties would have poll watchers there. If they'd given you $10 or a chicken or something like that, they were there to make sure that you voted the way you said you would. Okay, so votes were for sale, essentially. Okay, comments or questions about this? All right. Thank you very much. All right. Okay.